This is the story of a sword. From its 8th century original to its 21st century replica, an in-depth exploration about the process of making a pattern-welded sword. A few years ago, I embarked on the challenge of recreating the Vehmaa sword. This is a truly beautiful pattern-welded blade in which the Viking smith showed off his abilities by delivering a visually stunning blade fit for a king. I first saw this blade on Ian Pearce's book, Swords of the Viking Age. The blade was strategically placed towards the end of the book, and having browsed through the book's many other pages of stunning pattern-welded blades, it seemed as if the author's intent was in saving this sword to strike a final blow. I remember the moment like it was yesterday. As I was looking at the 2 pages showing both sides of the blade, my first thought was that they were 2 different swords, but it truly was only one. One sword to rule them all. A blade unearthed in Finland with not just one pattern, but a truly baffling combination of patterns on both sides, making it look like 2 different blades. For years, I couldn't help but thinking about how it could have been made. For someone who not only enjoys looking at the patterns, but who thrives on studying how they were made, I had met the challenge of a lifetime. Please understand that this is just my own perspective and interpretation. There are likely other ways to go about recreating this blade, and I will be glad to hear your opinions about it. So now, if you allow me to steal some of your time, well, maybe a bit more than that, I will tell you the story of how I went about replicating what I believe the original bladesmith did. I told this story years ago at Owen Bush's gathering in London, and enough time has gone by now that I feel is overdue on my part to share the tale with the rest of you. So sit back, relax, and follow me into this journey. We start by taking a look at the blade. This is an overall view of both sides. A pity the blade is broken, but this fracture is actually a blessing in disguise, as it will eventually allow me to study the blade's cross-section. The sword takes its name from Vehmaa, Finland, where it was found. The book only listed the measurements of some of the pattern-welded rods at around 1 centimeter in width. From those measurements, I extrapolated the blade's length at 80 centimeters, or about 30 inches, and a full length of 90 centimeters, including the tang. These photographs were scanned from the book, which in turn owes its copyright to this difficult-to-pronounce author and book. Go ahead and look at the blade for a moment, then we'll get right to analyzing what we're looking at. From now on, I am going to call the top view serpent side to differentiate it from the opposite side. On the serpent side, 3 distinct sections can be seen based on the pattern that they display. There's a checkerboard pattern at the base of the blade, with a small section that contains an inlay. This inlay is flanked by 2 straight small vertical bars. The next section is a chevron or herringbone pattern, alternating with a straight laminate. And the third is the serpent itself. On the opposite side, there are only 2 patterns. A chevron is straight at the base, and a checkers pattern at the pointy end. Let me show you my final recreation of the sword. You're looking at the serpent side, and this is the opposite side. Let's break down the visual analysis of the sword with more detail. Starting from the serpent side at its first section near the base, 2 bars of twisted rods can be identified. It may appear as if the rods are twisted in one direction and then the other. But if you have studied what the depth of grinding does to a simple twisted laminated billet, then you realize that this particular pattern is found after grinding exactly 50% off the twisted rod. And I mean that exactly. 50% right down the middle. A bit less grinding and the pattern goes in one direction. A little bit more grinding and it goes in the other direction, creating the illusion of opposite rotation. Next, and on top of the checkers pattern, there is a section damaged by corrosion. Sadly, this area contained an inlay of which I could only clearly see that it ends in 1 or 2 vertical straight inlay lines. After the inlay, a 3-bar section of alternating chevron and its straight laminate can be seen. This pattern repeats 4 times. The grinding is very shallow. No more than 10% of the rod can be removed before this pattern turns into something else, which, by the way, does happen in this blade. Here you can see that about 5 to 10% was ground off. And here you can see that the grinding went to about 25 to 30% deep. You can also see that the rods alternate in their twisting direction, with the 2 outer rods going in one direction and the central rod in another. The third section corresponds to the serpent. Looking at this section now allows me to see things I did not see originally. When I first studied the blade, I simply saw the serpent laying on top of what appeared to be 2 simple twisted rods. Both of those rods were twisted in the same direction. The serpent being made from a straight laminate. On the opposite side, the first section is made of the same pattern as in the second section of the serpent side. The only difference is that the chevron straight pattern repeats 6 times instead of 4, and it runs half the length of the blade. Also note that it starts and ends with a chevron, missing the last straight laminate. The last section of the opposite side is also a repeat. In this case, the pattern on the first section of the serpent side, a checkers pattern. This checkers pattern also shows the same appearance of changing the direction or rotation of the rods. Let's look at the basics of creating a pattern so that we can understand what happens in the Vehmaa blade. I used computer software to study this blade. Specifically, I used SolidWorks. But there is also another easier to use software that is free, called Thor 2. This one is available online, and I will leave a link in the description so you can look it up. Of course, there is Play-Doh and plasticine. You can manipulate those as you wish using your hands instead of having to use a computer. You're looking at a representation of a single billet of alternating layers, 10 layers in this case. Nowadays, we choose different steel types like 1095 and 15N20 to create the visual contrast. The Viking smith back then did the same thing with what he had available to him. Let's take the billet for a twist. I am twisting only one section of the billet so you can see the straight laminate on the left-hand side. The billet is twisted 3 times. That means 3 times 360 degrees of rotation, which generates 12 visible loops. 1 loop for each side of the billet, which has 4 sides. You immediately realize that this does not look like our blade's pattern. There are too many layers to start with, and also a large black loop that does not appear in the original. But for the purpose of running this exercise, we are going to keep using this billet to study what happens to the pattern when you grind off progressively on one side. This will be the computer equivalent of cleaning off the rough edges, which is what you do in your shop when you take your hammer to the twisted billet and re-square the sides. Pay particular attention to the look of the pattern, as we are going to start grinding off progressively deeper into one side. Obviously, we are going to grind off from the front side, not from the top, because we want to keep the straight laminate visible, just as the smith that made the Vehmaa sword did. Here, I have removed 10% off the face of the billet. The slanted lines resemble what we saw in the original blade, and so that's the appearance of the straight section of the billet. Not so much this hourglass pattern that forms in between. This is the result of having a black layer at the bottom of the billet. We will need to modify our laminated billet to solve this problem. Now I have taken 25% off the surface, and we see a pattern that can also be seen in the blade. This here resembles a twisted cross. The conclusion is that the smith took mostly 10% off to create the chevron pattern, but occasionally his grinding went deeper to about 25% or more. This didn't happen by mistake. This happens because it is easy enough to remove a bit too much off the surface when trying to create the right geometry in the final blade. Or it could have been because of trying to correct welding defects in the rods, and surely there could be other explanations. Notice that the slanting takes a backslash look when the billet has been twisted counterclockwise. This is also a familiar pattern that you can see in the original blade. It happens when you grind 50% off of the billet. It occurs exactly at the 50% mark. If you are a little off in your grinding, it will look different, and I will explain that in more detail later. If we go deeper in our grinding to about 75%, we see that the pattern is the same as we saw at 25%, with one difference. The slanting goes in the opposite direction. So with a counterclockwise twist, this pattern at 75% takes the form of a 4 slash. At 90%, we get the same pattern as we did with 10%, with the difference that the slanting, again, is in the opposite direction. So one could conceive the idea that if instead of grinding the bar and waste all that metal, we were to saw the bar at its length, then we will end up with more material with different patterns to play with. This is a plausible explanation, as it is unlikely that the smiths in the 8th century were very keen on wasting precious metal that took a long time and a lot of effort to produce in the first place. This is a real twisted billet with grinds from about 5% to 50%, made by a fellow bladesmith, Niels Provos. It illustrates what we have been describing earlier. This is a short clip showing you the process of twisting a billet a couple times and then grinding progressively from one end to the other and then back. Let's now try to figure out what the basic billet is that the Viking smith used. We will do this by studying the chevron pattern first, and I am going to switch from SolidWorks to Thor, which is simpler to use. I will display the billet layers here, and the result of twisting and grinding over here. In this case, we start off by testing a 10-layer billet of alternating colors and grind off about 10%. And we run into our first problem, the hourglass pattern that I had mentioned earlier. This tells us that we should switch to a billet that starts and ends with white layers for the top and the bottom, like this one here. We have now gotten rid of the hourglass, and we have something that looks more like the original. But I have ended up with 5 slanted layers in our twist, and the original only has 3. I'm going to cheat a little bit here and show you a much better image of the blade. This is an image that I did not have when I first started studying the blade. It came to me later by means of Mikko Moilanen, who was at the museum to study the blade. My gratitude goes to him. You can see that the original core of the blade has 3 bars and that each bar is a laminate of 7 layers. 2 thick white layers on top and bottom, while at the center there are 5 thinner layers alternating black and white. 3 of those are black and 2 are white. The total thickness of the central 5 layers closely approaches the thickness of each of the top and bottom white layers. With this information, we can now go back to recreate the pattern in Thor. We now have the proper dimensions and distribution of layers in the original billet that was used to create the chevron straight section of the blade. The 2 thicker top and bottom white layers combine to form a twice as thick white layer in the twisted billet that has the same rough dimensions as in the original blade. Notice that some sections of the chevron pattern show just a 5 to 10% grinding, but others go deeper to about 25 to 30%. This image is just a visual reminder of what the 25% ground off looks like. With the chevron straight section resolved, let's now try to figure out the checkers pattern. I have mentioned before that this pattern can only be seen at exactly 50% grinding. The 50% grind produces a perfectly symmetric checkers pattern. A little bit less, 45%, creates a slanting in one direction, a little bit more, 55%, and the slanting goes in the other direction. Upon reviewing the blade, you can see what I meant. Sometimes the pattern is slightly off in one direction, sometimes in the other. Sometimes it's exactly in the center. You might have already noticed that I started off with the same billet configuration that I used for the chevron pattern. Problem is, it does not produce the correct pattern for the checkers. It is similar, but is not the correct one. The smith used a different arrangement of layers for the checkers. Which one? This one. He stuck to the 3 black layers but shifted them to the bottom of the billet, and the other half was made of a thick white layer. This billet arrangement produces the correct patterns for the checkers as in the original blade. Now let me show you some slight variations in the grinding. 5% above and 5% below the center. It now resembles the original blade. At one point in modern times, the archaeologists must have cleaned up the blade and polished the core and etched it in acid to show the pattern. Much of that work remains visible, although it does get washed out towards the tip of the blade. You can see that the checkers pattern is made of 2 bars and that the grinding was a bit off-centered, like we had mentioned before. Sometimes the slanting of the pattern goes in one direction and sometimes in the other. For clarity, let's go back to the chevron straight pattern and rebuild it in SolidWorks. This one here represents a 5 to 10% grind, and this is the 25% grind. And finally something that resembles the original blade, with the grinding started at 10% and progressing up to 30%. This one here will be the checkers pattern. This SolidWorks image is the result of a perfect grind at the center of the bar. This will be the result of falling a bit too short on the grind, around 45%. And this will be the result of going a little bit too far, around 55%. Finally, I simulated an irregular grind. Sometimes right down the center, sometimes a bit deeper, and sometimes a bit shallower. This resembles more what happened in the original blade. We have one final pattern to figure out, the serpent. Look at the image carefully. When I first studied this pattern, I misunderstood how it was made. Luckily for you, you're going to have the benefit of hindsight. I will tell you how I interpret this pattern at present, but I will still walk you through my first attempt at reproducing the pattern when I misunderstood how it was made. So not to get you all confused, let me describe now what I think this pattern is as I understand it today. So take the information I present to you with a grain of salt. What I see now is that the smith used the same billet arrangement as he did for the chevron pattern. This one. The serpent itself is not a clever manipulation of the billet created by grinding, which is what I thought at first. The serpent is an actual inlay. A single rod was drawn out to length, then shaped into the serpent and inlaid into the core of the blade, which itself has a 3-bar billet as its main pattern. Let me see if I can convince you of this. Let's remove the serpent inlay so that your eyes don't get distracted by it, and just look at the bars that remain. I see 3 bars. The outermost bars are made of a continuous twist to form sort of a chevron pattern with no change in direction. For those 2 bars, the grinding is shallow at about 10%. The central bar is harder to make out. Looks like a simple straight laminate with no twist and with the white layers being smaller or thinner. Something like this. Maybe. The problem with the central bar is that it's covered with the serpent most of its length, making it very hard to see. I also think it's possible that the central bar doesn't even have the outer white layers, or any white layers at all. At any rate, it is really hard to see. Let's look at a nicer image of the serpent. Take a few moments and see if you agree with me so far. Do you see the core 3-bar billet? Do you see the continuous twist pattern of the 2 outer bars? Do you see the much tightly compressed straight laminate of the central bar? Which may be a thinner single black bar. And finally, do you see the inlaid serpent bar? Some of these things are easier to see than others, but I am open to suggestions and new ways to interpret this. Do you see something different? Let's look at the actual photograph. Take some time. Review the details. Did I convince you of my point of view? Did I not? Let me tell you about another thing I thought happened here, and I will try to prove it to you later down the road. Look here and here. Those are some defects in the inlay. A typical inlay is made by carving a channel the same size of the shape to be inlaid, and then the inlay is inserted into the channel or forge welded. Of course, there are other ways this could have been done. This is an example by a fellow bladesmith from Poland, Rafał Garbasik. First the channels are carved, then the inlay is inserted. Finally, it is forge weld solid. You can see some of the marks left over from the process. These marks are like the ones seen in the original Vehmaa sword. Although I should point out that those defects in the inlay can also be reproduced in a different way, and I will explain that at a later time. It's conceivable that this is how the serpent inlay was made, with the exception that carving the channel for the serpent would have been a very tedious and time-consuming process. And I do not think that that's how the Viking smith did it. There is an easier way, which I will demonstrate at the end of the presentation. Let's do a computer reproduction of the serpent pattern as to how I think it could have been done. Again, opinions may differ. Here you can see the core bars underlying the serpent inlay. This is the serpent bar laying on top just before being inserted in place. Then the serpent bar is inserted halfway and then fully set in. I think the resemblance to the original pattern is pretty good. So far we have a blade made of 12 bars arranged to create 5 groups. 2 groups on the opposite side to the serpent. One of those is a chevron straight pattern and the other a checkers pattern. And 3 groups on the serpent side of the blade. One is a checkers pattern and the second is a chevron straight pattern. The third one is reserved for the serpent inlay. The complexity of the core construction of this blade is not in the number of bars used. I've seen other bars historically with an even larger number of bars, although most of them used one single pattern to cover the length of the blade. The complexity of this blade lays on how the Viking smith used two simple billet arrangements to create a variety of patterns, and how he combined those patterns and inlays in the same core billet to create a visually striking look. And you haven't seen yet the most interesting characteristic of this blade's construction, as I did not see it myself in the beginning. I will save that for later to be true to the timeline of my progress. Enough with the theory. At one point, I felt I have done enough drawing on paper and on the PC, and it was time to get to the shop, light up the forge, and see how these ideas applied to the reality of working with a steel and a hammer. You might want to know that it took me about 3 to 4 years from the first time I saw that image in the book until the time I decided that I had done enough thinking and needed to gather together some practical knowledge by actually attempting to reproduce the blade. That was my first goal as I started gathering enough bars of 1095 and 15 and 20 steel. These bars were cut to about a foot length, or 12 inches. I apologize for the poorly focused image, but I think you can see how I arranged the layers for the billets. The one on top is for the chevron straight. 1095 steel will create a white layer, and 15 and 20 will create a dark layer when polished and etched. The bottom one is for the checkers pattern. The billet is about 12 inches long and 1 inch wide by 1 inch thick. I split the two billets in half to make 4 billets 6 inches in length each, which were easier to handle in my forge. Each one of those weighed about 650 grams. I then welded a piece of rebar to each billet to get ready for forge welding. This was the chevron billet getting ready to weld. I was using a propane forge made of refractory material that I designed myself. The forge will get hot enough that the bottom floor became molten during operation. One bar is done and has been drawn to about a half an inch thick bar. I built a purpose-made twisting jig for this job. The jig allowed me to twist a section of the bar at the exact dimensions I wanted, where I wanted. It consisted of a stud plate to establish the length at which the twist will start, and a working section that could also be adjusted to length when the bar will actually be twisted. The handle served as an index on its down position, so I could precisely count how many turns I was twisting each time. Do not worry about the details. I will share how to build this twisting jig at the end of the video. At this point, I was experimenting a bit with factors like bar thickness and how many twists per length to do. I started using a bar of a half an inch thickness and was curious as to how this will translate in the final blade after all it's drawn out and forged to shape. I chose what I thought would turn out to be the correct measurements, but I needed to gather this data first for future corrections. One of the chevron straight bars is ready, and one of the checkers bars is ready as well. A few more to go, of course. Notice the punched hole marks on the face of the billet that shows me where the straight laminate face is. I use the shield of my forging press as a chalkboard to keep track of what I have done to each billet and what I had left to do to each one then. Allow me to translate. The first line says, I am going to start twisting 2 inches away from the stop plate, and I will mark a section of 1 inch to be twisted 5 times counterclockwise. On the second line, I am going to move the bar 3 1/4 inch away from the stop plate and select a section of about 1 inch length to be twisted 5 times clockwise this time. Doing the math, I will have a 2-inch section straight, followed by a 1-inch counterclockwise twisted section, followed by 1 1/4 straight, and another 1-inch twist clockwise. The rest you can figure out. I need to do this 3 times to make the 3 chevron straight bars. One of those 3 will be in reverse direction of twisting. In the image to your right, you can see how the rods were starting to take shape to form the chevron straight section of the blade. This section over here shows the steps to make the checkers pattern, which I need to do 2 times as I need 2 bars. Notice that I have written instructions to alternate the twist for the checkers pattern. When I first started on these bars, I did not know that the differences in orientation of the checkers were due to grinding a bit shallower or a bit deeper, and I thought that this myth actually twisted the bars. I was careful to measure the resulting elongation of the bar to see if my originally planned distances for the twisted sections were correct. Notice too, the punched tiny hole on one side of the bar to have a visual reference to know the orientation of the layers in the bar. Otherwise, during hot work, I would have been lost. The bars were square off and cleaned up a bit before welding. Here they are, picking up temperature before the weld, and nicely welded together. I like to multitask. You can't have too many irons in the forge. Well, yes, you can, but it usually doesn't work out. Here comes another tricky part. I have made the 3-bar chevron straight sections, and I have the 2 bars that will make the checker section, but how do I put them together? This was my plan. I was going to leave a small triangular section in the central bar of the chevron straight, and scarf the ends of the checkers bars, then forge weld all together. Why did I do that? Look at this image. You're looking at the transition from the chevron pattern to the checkers. This is on the opposite side of the serpent, by the way. Study it for a little bit. What do you see? This is what I saw. I saw the 3 bars of the chevron here, and the 2 bars of the checkers here, and the junction between them here. And this is what I saw here. Can you see that? Let's erase all of these lines. Look at it again. Do you see it now? This is what I thought the first time I looked at this, and what I set off to do in my first reproduction attempt. The core bars measure about 1 inch in width and about 3/4 of an inch in thickness. The length was about 27 inches, not counting what would become the tang. Some trimming was needed for the excess material from the tip. Here I am ready to weld the outer edges to the core. Bound tight and ready to weld. Welded together, and the tank has been forged as well. Profiling will be done at the grinder. In terms of weight, my calculations were way off. The blade is too heavy. I must admit that I took several shortcuts for this first reproduction. My idea was to gather information about the primary patterns, the chevron and the checkers, and about the precise measurements of the elongations of the patterns during the forging. I did not try to reproduce the serpent in this first attempt. That will be for later. I also did not bother to forge the fuller or the edges. My plan was just to simply grind everything to shape. This was just my first prototype, and I was using it primarily to further my knowledge on how to make the blade correctly. I built a grinding jig just for this blade. It will allow me to grind the fuller and the edges more precisely. Here's the final grind before heat treat and hardening the edges. After some more grinding, the weight wasn't too far off, but still too heavy. Unfortunately, not only the weight was off, many other things were wrong. For example, notice the transition between patterns here. It doesn't look like the original, but the dimensions of the twisted and straight sections weren't too far off. And what happened here taught me of another mistake I made that would need another approach to correct. When you grind off too much, you end up showing what is underneath. I had sandwiched a layer of plain 1095 steel at the center of the blade to figure out the correct amounts to grind off the surface without going too deep. If I happened to ground into the plain 1095, I was going too far, which is exactly what happened. Not all was lost, and I had learned quite a bit from this first attempt. Although there were other things I needed to figure out, like how to go about reproducing the serpent, how to get the measurements of the twisted and straight sections more precise, how to correctly get the looks of the straight sections, how not to grind too deep, but at the correct depth for each section. The end result was a pleasing sword that had served its purpose. So, I had gathered all this knowledge from my first reproduction attempt that it deserved a second go at it. Otherwise, I would have just kept staring at these 2 pages for years to come, feeling that I had fallen short. Before embarking on my second and more informed try, I needed to go back and review the information I had gathered so far. For the checkers pattern, I have already figured out that there was no need to do any twisting in order to see the different slanting that is seen in the original. It's just a matter of realizing that this pattern exists in the blade at a very shallow margin of error. If you nail the 50%, you get one look, and a little bit above and below that level, you get the other looks. This is going to happen naturally as you forge the blade to shape and grind it. One lesson learned is that it's likely that the smith forged very close to final shape, and there was little grinding done to the blade. This is consistent with the idea of saving precious metal, which was important in the time when the original blade was made. Another detail that I learned about the checkers is that for this pattern, it is okay to mess up the orientation of the bar prior to grinding. I did not need a pilot punch hole in the bars, as you arrive to the same pattern in the center of the bar, whether you grind from the top or from the front of the bar. One more thing. Since we are grinding to the center of the bar, it does not matter if we twist these bars clockwise or counterclockwise. In other words, despite the difficulty with this pattern existing only at a very narrow margin around the center of the bar, it is a very forgiving pattern in terms of orientation of the bar itself. The chevron straight pattern, on the other hand, is more forgiving in the grinding depth. The original sword shows depths of grinding from 5 to 30%, but the pattern is more demanding in keeping the orientation and direction of the twist precisely, as it can only be done correctly in one way. And there is the matter of the serpent. I have already told you what I think of how the pattern was made. During this second attempt, I was thinking that the serpent was created through a grinding strategy, and I did not realize it was an inlay. So, as I take on the challenge for a second time, you will see me using a grinding process to bring out the serpent. This was one other issue that gave me a headache on my first blade. Remember that this is how I thought the transitions between the different patterns were done? Look at it again. Pay attention to the top bar of the chevron and follow it into the top bar of the checkers. Do that again. Now look at the bottom bar. Follow the chevron into the checkers too. Do you see it? Let me make it easier for you. Look at the line drawing and let's remove the stop lines between the patterns. Keep that image in mind. And now look at the picture of the blade. Do you see it now? Focus on the top bar. The whole thing is one single bar from the moment it starts as a chevron straight pattern as it goes through the transition and continues into the checkers pattern. It's one single bar, and so is the bottom bar. They were both made the same way. So, what we're looking at is a single continuous bar that gets modified to display two different patterns, one at the beginning of the rod, another one at the end of the rod. Wow! This was very much alike what I did when I used this strategy to weld the tip of the blade before. Of course, this presented a problem, a very serious problem for me. How do I transition a bar with this layer arrangement to a bar with this other arrangement? To make it even more complex a problem, each bar is going to have a different depth of grind. I was going to start thinking in Viking smith terms to understand how this was done. This is how I thought the bars were arranged. This greatly simplifies the construction of the core of the blade. Remember, in my first attempt, I was working with 12 bars, and now I only need 5 to build the core. But I am making it sound too easy. In reality, this problem had me puzzled for several months. I am not kidding when I tell you that I kept thinking about it during the day and dreaming about it during the night. I was stuck. I could not even get started on my second attempt until after I figured this one out. It makes perfect sense that the bar is one and only because of what we have talked about the economy of steel in those times. It was important to save as much metal as possible. I also believe that this smith was a show-off. He was very skilled, very ingenious, and wanted to leave something behind that will tell generations to come how good he was. Before I give you the answer, let's go back to the serpent pattern, as it will give you a clearer explanation as to how I think the transitions were done. From left to right in the original blade, we start with a chevron pattern, which is followed by a straight laminate. It will be easier if you just looked at the bottom bar. The straight laminate continues on to form a continuous twist pattern. The top bar does the same, but it is harder to see as it lays under the first serpent wave. But if you follow it a little bit down the line, you can see that it carries on to make a continuous twist pattern as well. This is the SolidWorks version of what I just described. The central bar remains untwisted and is pulled up to form the serpent bar, which will be forged into waves and inlaid later. The void space underneath is either filled in with a dark bar or more elegantly filled in with the slitted-in-half bar or the serpent. I think I have given you enough food for thought, and remember that this is what my current thinking is as to how the serpent pattern was made. It is not how I was thinking when I was tackling my second attempt, which is what you will see next. But before I could even start my second try, remember that I was stuck on resolving the issue of the transitions between patterns so that they could have been made with a single bar. I am not going to make you sit for 6 months and wait to find out the solution like I did. This billet is the answer. It has the chevron straight pattern on one end and the checkers pattern on the other. It can easily be built using several layers of steel of the same thickness that can be piled up together to create a thicker or thinner color layer. A simple and elegant solution. Let's get started. I will begin by gathering and preparing some steel bars. I will use 6 by 1 inch steel bars of 1095 and 15N20. All the bars were 1/8 of an inch thick. 3 of the 1095 bars are cut at 45-degree angles through the center. The billet is built starting from the top using 2 half layers of 1095, followed by full layers of 15N20, alternating with 1095 3 times. Add 1 more full layer of 1095 and finish with 3 half layers of 1095, and we are ready to forge weld. Here's the billet warming up in the forge, all welded up and drawn out. Measures look about right. Remember that I had a lot of practice before to figure out what the lengths were that I needed, based on how much distortion occurs when twisting and drawing out. And the weight looks about right too. The billet was almost 1 kilogram, having lost about 100 grams during the forging process. I realized that it is hard to see in the image, but the 2 patterns are there. To the left, the layers that will make the chevron, and to the right, the checkers. The transition zone between the 2 patterns got stretched out a bit, and I am curious as to how that will look in the final piece. First, I needed to make a total of 4 of these billets, and I need a 5th one with the chevron pattern for the central part of the serpent. This billet will be a standard billet with all layers of the same dimensions. Now I had all 5 bars cleaned up and ready to go. I also needed to etch the bars with acid to look at the patterns and carefully note the orientation, the beginnings, the ends, and the exact position of the transition zone between the patterns. The most critical to get correct were the orientation of the bars and the location of the transition zone, which I have figured out here for all 4 bars. There will be some excess material from the ends, but I have all the bars lined up and ready to twist. These 3 bars will become the chevron straight on the opposite side. These 2 bars will become the checkers for the opposite side. Even though I had figured out I did not need to twist the checkers to get the different slanting in the pattern, I still wanted to introduce some randomness, and I went ahead and planned to twist it. These 2 bars will become the checkers on the serpent side. These 3 bars will become the chevron straight and the serpent. I am using the 5th bar I made with the simple chevron billet pattern as the center bar here. The first section with the checkers straight laminate is ready, and so is the second section with the checkers pattern. The third section also with the checkers pattern, and the 4th section with the chevron straight laminate continuing on to the serpent. If you're curious about the level of complexity when doing the twist, take a look at my notes. I had to keep track and stay focused all the time. A single miss would have meant ruining one of the bars and having to start all over again. For example, I had to take the bar that would have the chevron straight pattern and make sure I measure correctly as to where the twisted section will lay and where the straight section will lay, and the correct direction of the twist, clockwise or counterclockwise. That same bar will have the checkers pattern at the other end, and I needed to keep the distances correct too. Some bars will be used for the serpent side, others for the opposite side. The 5th bar will be used for both sides. I really had to stay sharp and not lose my concentration. So I opted to do all this work in one single day. This was the easier way to not forget what I had done to each individual billet and lose track. Here is the end result with all the bars twisted correctly according to their corresponding sections. Now it may start to make sense to you what I was doing before. Starting from the opposite side of the serpent, which corresponds to the top 3 bars in the image, the top bar has the checkers straight pattern. There is excess material at the beginning of the bar that will become part of the tang. And I added a twisted section there just in case I fell short, but it wasn't needed in the end. This bar continues on to form the checkers pattern towards the other end. 1/2 of the 5th bar is inserted here to complete the central bar of the checkers straight pattern, and it's twisted in the opposite direction to the top or bottom bars. The 3rd bar from the top completed the patterns, and it is made the same way as the first top bar. The side opposite the serpent is done. Next, on to the serpent side. The 4th bar started with the short checkers pattern and continued to the chevron straight section before the serpent. It finished with the continuous chevron which underlines the serpent. The other half of the 5th bar is inserted here to form the central bar of the chevron straight first, and finishes on a single straight laminate which would become the serpent. The 6th bar was a repeat of the 4th one and completed the pattern on the serpent side. As I contemplated the bars laid out on the table, I realized the simplicity of this solution. I only needed 4 bars with the transition, 2 of them identical to each other, and 1 bar without the transition to recreate the final blade. A 12-bar project shortened to 5 bars. This is how I was planning to forge weld the opposite side. The transition between the patterns was easier to forge weld this way. At the top, the serpent side was ready to be welded, and at the bottom, the opposite side was already forge welded. As you can see, the transition zones were looking like the original blade. Here and here. Moving on to the serpent pattern. The plan was to use a grinding manipulation to create the serpent pattern. It will look similar to the original blade, but as I told you before, this is not how I think it was done originally. I will give you a more detailed explanation on how to do the inlay method at the end. I started by grinding off semicircular sections and rounding up the corners. Then it was heated in the forge and forged flat. With all the welding and forging completed, you can now see the results of the two sides of the core lying next to each other. In a close-up image, the detail of the pattern is not quite like the original, but it's close enough. Here, I was trying to figure out the alignment of each side of the core relative to each other before proceeding to forge weld them together. First, let's look at what we have so far a little bit closer, including a good look at my socks. I will be panning from left to right with some overlapping in the images. This was the tang end of the blade. There was excess metal over here. This will become the tang. This was the 3-bar chevron straight on the opposite side to the serpent, and this was the 2-bar short checkers on the serpent side. More of my socks, and farther to the right of the bars. Continuing with the 3-bar chevron straight on the opposite side, the transition, and the 2-bar checkers. The end of the short 2-bar checkers on the serpent side, the transition, and the 3-bar chevron straight. The end of the 2-bar checkers on the opposite side, and the end of the 3-bar chevron straight on the serpent side. Then the serpent itself. The excess material at the end of the bars will be trimmed off to end up with clean bars ready to weld. But what happens to the excess in thickness? Because it's easy enough to get rid of the excess in length. But what about the thickness? The bars measure about 3/8 of an inch each, making the final thickness of the blade 3/4 of an inch. That's more than 3 times what it should have been. Quite a bit of this extra metal had to go, but where did it need to be trimmed away from? That depends on the pattern that you wanted to show on the blade. After having removed that from the face of the bars, what was left was simple math. Let me make it clearer to you. So, it's straightforward that some excess needed to be removed from the face of the bars, and that was just to achieve the desired pattern. That will be about 10 to 20% off for the chevron, 40 to 50% off for the checkers. Notice that I was not doing exactly 10% for the chevron or 50% off for the checkers. I was leaving myself some extra margin to trim off later when I grind the sword to the final shape. That final grinding to achieve the geometry of the blade will take off an additional 5 to 10%, which I needed to account for now. After having removed the excess material from the face to show the pattern, I needed to add up what was left, and everything in excess of 1/4 inch was going to be removed. Except, this time not from the face of the bars, but from the back. Does that make sense? Let me explain. This is what I call face grinding. How much of the face of the bar needs to be taken off in order to show the desired pattern. I have divided the bars in two to make them fit in one screen. You can see that I needed about 15% off the face of the chevron straight and 40% off the checkers pattern. I don't really have to remove much of the serpent pattern. Looking at the bars from the side might make it easier to understand what I needed to do next. I have 2 bars that measure roughly 3/8 of an inch in thickness. One represents the serpent side, the other the opposite side. The pattern is on the face, and I will remove the material from the face to show the desired pattern. But some amount needs to be ground off the back to make the final thickness of the two bars put together be about 1/4 inch. The bars will be put together back to back, so that both faces will be showing. Let's clean up the image to make things easier to see. On the opposite bar, I start by taking material off the face to show the correct pattern. The material removed is shown here in black. The red color is what is left. 15% off the chevron, 40% off the checkers. On the serpent bar, we do the same to its face. 40% off the checkers, 15% off the chevron, and I will extend that to a 5% for the serpent. The problem is that there is excess material all over the bars. Very evidently here, where I have close to full thickness on both bars, which can be fixed by removing material here on this particular bar and from here on the other bar. So let's do it. I must admit that this is a very wasteful part of this process. The alternative would have been to saw it off or to slit it, and that way less metal was lost. The trimmed material could then be used to make other blades. You can see some of the areas I have already trimmed according to plan. And some more needs to be trimmed over here. The end result will hopefully give me the thickness that I'm after once it's all forge welded together and ground to shape. That desired thickness is just over 1/4 inch. I forgot I also needed to prepare a billet to make the edges of the blade. One side is ready here and the other side here. And this is how I plan to complete the point of the blade. Ready for the final forge weld, getting to welding temperature in the forge. With all the welds completed, I move on to determining where the tang would be. This I will clean up in the grinder. I did make a profile of the blade in wood, which I used as a guide. This will become the point of the blade. Starting to clean up the surface a bit to take a look at how the pattern looked. Unfortunately, the serpent pattern had stretched out too much during forging. I apologize for the bad quality of the images, but these are the only pictures I have left. This one here shows the transition between the 2-bar pattern to the 3-bar pattern. The chevron is straight. The checkers look like it would need a bit more grinding than anticipated to get to the center of the bar. Sorry again about the quality of the images. Here you can see that I had forged the bevels and the fuller, and I was starting the heat treat process. Unfortunately, the blade ended up with a warp towards the point, which I was able to straighten at first. This was after heat treat, still way too heavy, but there is quite a bit of material left to remove. Another view, I have inscribed the lines to mark the bevels for the grinder. Now it has started to look more like a blade. Still too heavy. Ideally the blade should weigh under 1 kilo, and this one was going to overshoot the mark. I will need to consider that for future blades. On the other hand, everything else was looking really nice and the patterns were correct. As I was grinding steel away, the blade started to take a slight curvature towards the point again. I did try to straighten it in a vise, but as more steel was being removed, the curvature became more obvious, likely due to some internal tension in the crystalline structure of the steel. So it was back to the vise again. And then this happened. Upon close inspection, there was an inclusion in one of the welds that created a stress riser, and when I applied force in the vise to correct the curvature, the blade broke. It was heartbreaking. 2 months of work gone in a second. Not all that work was for nothing. I had learned quite a bit about the patterns and how to make things better now. I should also figure out how to fix some of the shortcomings of this second attempt. After mulling over the disaster for a night or two, What else was there to do but to get up the next morning, lay out new chunks of steel, and get ready for Vehmaa number 3. By now you know the process. First make the billets, and while they are hot, turn it into bars. Clean up the bars, lay out the twists. This is the 3-bar chevron straight on the opposite side, the 2-bar checkers, the 3-bar chevron is straight on the serpent side. The serpent will be done by grinding, but this time I will make the waves tighter. Square the bars thinner than 3/8 of an inch to avoid having as much wasted metal. I was making good progress. Both sides of the core were done and ready to grind off the face and off the back so that they will be thinner than the previous blade, which ended up weighing too much. Let's review. I am looking from the tang. I etched the bar so that the pattern could be easily seen and marked how much grinding I needed to do for each section and whether the grinding was off the front or off the back. Another section ready. This is the area towards the point of the blade. Excess material from both ends is removed. The final thickness after welding the 2 bars of the core together should be between 1/4 inch and 3/8 of an inch. And this one was 5/16 of an inch. Gotta love the imperial measuring system, no? For reference, here is an image of the core and the edge bars together. I was going for a wraparound edge this time. This bit of swelling in the middle is to account for the point of the blade, like so. Ready to do the final weld. The edges and the core were secure in place. Everything is welded. I am moving pretty fast here, but that took me about a week. Certainly, I was getting a lot of practice and could move along the different tasks with more ease. Let's review what I had so far. This is the tip of the blade. The serpent looked nice and tight. The pattern was clearly visible from the oxidation that happens during forging. The chevron was tight, and so were the checkers. Also, the depth of grinding looked like it was just right. I did like how the serpent turned out even if it was not made using an inlay. Take a look at the transition between the checkers and the chevron. This did resemble the original to me. Time to start grinding. After the heat treat, the blade looked very pretty with the tempering colors. Look at the checkers. Some of them were right at the 50% mark. Some were a bit off in one direction and the other direction too, just like the original. The serpent side. I had not intended originally to hilt the blade, but it was begging to have one done. This is the opposite side. The serpent. The chevron straight. The checkers. Look at the transition from chevron to serpent. It resembled the original. And the transition from chevron to checkers. At this point, I just couldn't do without making a scabbard. One final image before moving on to Vehmaa number 4. My next version of the sword was going to take in all the new knowledge accumulated and take it a step farther. My idea was to fix what I had done incorrectly so far, which included, number 1 and most important, get the serpent done as an inlay. Number 2, do the missing inlay that sits closer to the tang. Number 3, get the weight and the length right. Number 4, make it like it was made, not from modern steel, but from smelted iron, steel and phosphoric iron. To do all of that, I gathered some additional information. Some I had already shared with you. I had obtained more detailed images and information from Finland thanks to Mikko. The blade, or what is left of it now, weighs 711 grams. It measures close to 31 inches from the tip to the beginning of the tang, a lighter and longer sword than I thought it was. It is by looking at these images that I understood that the serpent was indeed an inlay. Let's review them. Here's the blade section, which we are lucky enough to see thanks to the fracture. The cross-section view hints to an iron layer sandwiched between the two layers of the core. The tang of the blade. Notice a couple of curiosities. The pinion remains, and the pattern runs through the core of the tang. I have shared this one with you earlier. It's a nicer view of the chevron straight pattern, and in this image you can clearly see the transition from the 3-bar chevron to the 2-bar checkers pattern. This one here shows the area where the inlay is, unfortunately damaged by corrosion. Nevertheless, Mikko was also able to provide a visual interpretation of the damaged inlay. Here's the transition from the chevron to the serpent and the fracture of the blade. I can't help thinking that this fracture resembles the one that happened in my second attempt. Here's the point of the blade and a detail of the serpent. A beautiful blade. Additionally, Mikko has written a book, Finnish Swords from the 7th century, which details the Vehmaa sword, recognizing it as unique in many ways. Mikko agrees with the interpretation of the serpent as an inlay. In talking about the serpent, let's look at it and see how we could reproduce it. This is my first test to work out the details to create the serpent as an inlay, using the central bar of the 3-bar pattern and splitting it in half. One half remains as part of the 3-bar pattern underneath, and the lifted up half becomes the serpent. I had done the waves by hand, which resulted in an irregular pattern as in the original blade. The bottom half of the split is sandwiched between the two twisted rods to form the 3-bar pattern. Notice that I have pulled back the serpent. This is to heat up only the base rods where the serpent will be inlaid, without heating up the serpent itself. With the base rods preheated, I have now folded forward the serpent to prepare to hammer it in. And this is the end result. You can see that it resembles the original, even to the point of showing some of the inlay defects that the original had. I mean those gaps in the inlay. Remember that I had pointed out earlier that you don't have to carve a channel to create this pattern? You can do that inlay by simply hammering it in, and it will look like the original blade. Let's run another test. Here's the single bar split in half down its length. Here's one side of the split bar pulled back. One half becomes the serpent, the other half is inserted between the other two rods. The base bars are preheated and ready for the inlay. The final pattern as a result. It is a bit tricky. As you can see, my serpent slipped to one side and also fractured. This is because I was hammering the inlay too cold. Let's move on to the next process that I needed to sort out for this 4th attempt. I wanted to use materials that were close to the originals used by the Viking smith. That was iron, steel, and phosphoric iron. For this purpose, I built a remelting hearth. This is a simple forge, using charcoal as fuel. The basic concept is to take iron made in a smelter, run it by the air blast coming from the tuyere until it melts and collects at the bottom of the forge. Depending on several factors, of which the most important one is the depth of the floor of the forge, one can end up by making refined iron, steely iron, or even pure steel. The puck of metal that results can then be collected from the bottom of the forge and taken for further refinement. I will be using a forging hydraulic press to consolidate the metal. In several heats, the puck will be turned into a bar. Which will be folded over several times to further refine it. These are all bars made in the way that I just showed you. Some of them are made from iron blooms, either high or low in phosphorus, and also some steel remelted from bloomery iron. Another important step that you can do at the same time that you clean up the bars in the grinder is to notice the sparks that come from the bars. The bars that are higher in carbon will show significantly more sparks. The plan is to forge weld all the bars together and then draw them out and etch them in acid to see what contrast they yield. This stack has several bars, some of them made with iron, some of them with steel, some of them with phosphoric iron, and even I had added modern steel for comparison purposes. It looks promising. After drawing out and stretching, I can see which bands produce better contrast. This bar will be square off in order to twist it. I run into a problem when twisting this type of primitive metal. It does not want to twist easily, as modern steel does, without breaking or delaminating. This is one of my first twisting tests. As you can see, it didn't go so well. The bars were only twisted a couple times. They did not hold up very well. They sheared, and I wasn't quite sure if this was due to welding failures or simply that the material didn't offer enough resistance to twisting. So here we are, ready for another test. In this test, I'm looking to create contrast by using different source materials in the different layers of the final pattern welded blade. I'm also looking to see how strong the material is in terms of resistant the force of the twist without shearing. I have two bars, both about the same cross section, a 1/4 inch by 1 inch. This shorter bar is made of blueberry iron that has been hard refined in order to carburize it and create a high carbon, about 1% carbon bar. I'm expecting to see a darker bar in the final contrast between the layers from that bar. This other bar was made from iron oxide from a mine in Virginia that is known to have high phosphorus. I'm expecting to see a bright bar in the final blade or test piece. I will be putting these parts together in a pattern that resembles the one in the original Vehmaa sword. I will be looking for the contrast, as I said, and I will be looking to see if they go through the twisting process without shearing. After refining the metal, I can see that the twisting behavior is improving, and this is very encouraging. You can see here the progression in my twist tests from really bad in the center to improving on top to looking nice on the bottom. I had arranged this billet the same way that I did for the Vehmaa sword chevron pattern. As you can see, I am getting closer to getting the desired results. Don't you think? During the process of forging these bars, I also came up with a solution to the overweight blade. As you recall, my earlier attempts always ended up in a blade that was way too heavy. The solution is simple: a smaller billet to begin with. And the way to achieve that is by forging even a smaller square bar. When I started this project, my first square bars were 1/2 inch thick. Then I moved on to 3/8 of an inch. The solution is 1/4 inch. And of course, this is going to make things harder in terms of forging and twisting. But it's worth going in that direction, as I have a feeling that the original Viking smith also used very small bars. If you pay close attention to the patterns in those two bars in the image, you can see the resemblance is getting closer to the original blade, and the layer arrangement and color contrast that I'm after. And it's looking even better after a few more tests, even if some of the tests were creating some really funky patterns. Remember the transition problems between the patterns in order to make one single bar the whole length of the blade? We had solved this problem earlier, and this was the solution to the problem. Well, there is an alternative solution, which is this. And I just happened to come across this by pure chance. It's even easier to put together. This simpler billet arrangement also resulted in wasting less material and being able to reduce the weight of the final blade. Let me offer you a visual explanation. When I talk about high P and low P, I refer to high or low phosphorus in the iron bar. I cut enough parts to make 2 billets, but I will show you how to put together one of the billets so you get an idea. So this is the layer material. Again, high P, low P, high P, low P, high P. 5 layers into this. This is simple iron, low P, and another section of the low P, simple iron. The final billet will be put together with this in the middle, this either top or bottom, it doesn't really matter, and the other one off to the side. One of the difficulties that I created for myself was that I had to redesign my twisting jig. I had made 2 of these so far. One for the 1/2 inch square bars and the other for the 3/8 inch square bars. Now I am going to be working with 1/4 inch square bars, so I need a new one. Let me explain how this jig works. This is the rotating head and arm. The arm stays in the down position and serves as an index so that I know how many turns I'm putting into the billet. The head is what actually does the rotation. This middle section holds the billet and is movable so that I can set the distance that I want to twist. At the end is the stop plate, which can also be moved to determine the distance for the twist. This image you may want to pause the video and watch carefully, as it shows you all the individual pieces taken apart. Hopefully you will be able to understand how to build it based on it. If not, let me know in the comments and I'll be glad to make a video with a description how to make this jig in more detail. This is how the twisting head and arm operates. And this is how the other parts move and lock and determine the twist length and distance to the twist. This is where the story ends. Circumstances in my life changed, and I had to leave the forge behind. The 4th Vehmaa sword was never completed. I had not given up. This project was, after all, a dream, and dreams never die. Maybe one day I will find my way back into a shop somewhere, and I could do what I like to do. Pick up a hammer and forge that sword.